And happy Sabbath. I think I'm on. In the Philippines, record keeping has not always been that great. So, this past May 4th was one of my mom's birthdays. You see, we're not sure exactly when she was born. My dad used to say it was May 4th or July 4th to pick a date, one or the other. But his theory was that the egg was laid on May 4th, and then it hatched on July 4th. So my mom has the privilege of having two birthdays. It's kind of hard to be doubtful about the day that you're born. But she's learned to live with that, and we certainly get kicks and laughs about when she was actually brought into our world here. This morning we're looking at another form of doubt with Thomas. The story of Thomas is one that has been difficult throughout the week to look at, just to recount and to think about all that Thomas went through in his life. I don't know if it's really fair that we put on Thomas that title of Doubting Thomas, but nevertheless, throughout the pages of history and throughout Christian history, that's what he is known as. So we want to look and study a little bit this morning in regards to Thomas. If you'd look there with me in John chapter 20 and verses 24 and 25. Thomas, called the twin, and by the way, whenever you look and study in Scripture and you come across Thomas, that's typically how he's referred to. Not sure if he's fraternal or identical, but he was a twin, and you'll see that in the Old King James Version. It says Didymus, which just means duplicate, basically. So I'd guess identical, but we don't know for sure. Maybe he had a sister that was born alongside with him. I don't know. Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, "We have seen the Lord." So he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hands into his side, I will not believe." Have you ever been to a party or to a gathering of people, and you kind of come right in the middle of it, and people are laughing, and they're talking, and they're discussing something, and you have no idea what's going on? You ever been to that? You ever had something like that happen to you? This is kind of the feeling that Scripture gives to us with Thomas. He's entering in, and these disciples who were so despondent, so depressed at one point, on Sabbath, that's probably the Sabbath day that was the saddest in all of history after Jesus was crucified, these disciples were just down in the ditches. They were just down in the dumps. But then Sunday morning comes, and of course Jesus is raised again, and he reveals himself to them, and Thomas isn't there. He doesn't get the joy that these other disciples are experiencing. And so we have this portion of Scripture that we've read this morning. And these disciples are just rejoicing, saying, "We've seen him, we've seen him, we've seen him." But he is not there. He, in his own mind, can't fathom a risen Lord. Now think back to Jesus' ministry. Realize that Christ had raised plenty of people from the dead. Christ had stopped entire funeral processions of young people and raised them from the dead. And Thomas was there to see that. Thomas was there to see Christ, in John chapter 11, raise Lazarus from the tomb. Thomas knew that Christ had that power and ability. What was hard for him, what the transition for him, was to think about Jesus himself raising from the dead. This was such a depressing time for Thomas that he could not fathom his Lord coming back to life. And so we have verse 25, where Thomas says, "Show me the proof. Tell me that it's real. Show me that it's real. Unless it's right in front of me, I'm not going to believe it." You know, it's the same way that we react. If somebody comes up to us and says, "I can run a marathon," or I can paint like Michelangelo, or I can compose music like Mozart. Our reaction is, "Yeah, right. Prove it. Go run that marathon. Go ahead. Let me see your paintings. Let's see what you got." That's our reaction, and this is exactly how Thomas is reacting. He's reacting rationally. He wants proof that Jesus is alive. Now notice verse 26 of our scripture reading here this morning. And after 8 days, so this is 8 days that Thomas has to be in this doubt and despondency. No matter what the other apostles tell Thomas, no matter how they coax him, no matter what pictures they draw, no matter what proof they can produce from their own minds, no matter how many people are coming to him saying, yeah, Jesus is alive, he's still struggling. He's still despondent. He's still in that place thinking to himself, yeah, right, prove it. I don't see it, guys. It's just not there. It's just not real to me. You're not saying anything that's really convincing me. You're not really proving anything to me by saying this again and again and again. I don't care what you say, to me Jesus is still dead someplace. I don't believe that he's around. But after 8 days, his disciples were again inside. Now, to Thomas's credit, he doesn't just give up. He doesn't just abandon everything and go and be someplace else. He holds on to the friendships that he has with Peter, with Bartholomew, with the rest of the disciples, Simon the Zealot, all these guys gathered together, Andrew, and he's there with them. And finally, after 8 days, as they were again inside, Thomas was with them. Jesus came, and the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, "Peace to you." Now, this is beyond belief. Now, what would Thomas's reaction in your mind's eye be? If you could imagine him in that room, the doors being shut, all the disciples there, and Jesus all of a sudden is right there, what do you think Thomas's reaction would be? I have an indication that part of him is going, yes, it's true, he's reaching out, but in another part is wanting to slink in a corner, ashamed and guilty for the way that he's been acting over these last 8 days. Now, have you ever made anybody angry in your life? Maybe that's a dumb question. Of course we have. When somebody's upset with you, one of the most irritating things is when you get into a room with them and they just avoid you. They don't make eye contact with you. They look away like this. They don't want to talk to you. Even if you approach them, they just kind of like, yeah, whatever. Just give you very bland and plain answers. Isn't that irritating? Isn't that annoying? Now, Jesus has watched Thomas over this 8 days, and he sees this right there. Christ does not deal with us in that same manner. He deals directly with us as he deals with Thomas, directly right here in verse 27. Then he said to Thomas, so first he gives this general greeting, peace to you, to all his disciples. And then he deals directly with Thomas. Then he said to Thomas, reach your fingers here and look at my hands. And reach your hands here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. Now, this is something that's to Thomas's credit once again. Verse 28, he reacts and says, my Lord and my God. But this text, verse 27, tells us something very significant about Jesus and his crucifixion, about everything that he went through, about his sacrifice for us. Those scars don't go away. Those nail prints and nails that went through his feet also are still there. That spear that pierced his side, those wounds are there for eternity, as a reminder to us of the great sacrifice that Christ made in our behalf. And Christ willingly shares those scars. Now, this isn't one of those masculine things, where guys get together and we like to share our scars. Yeah, this is where I put a chainsaw on my foot. That kind of thing, It's not like that. Yeah, I did that one time, but that's beyond the point of the story. The reason those scars are there is as a reminder to us of where we came from and why we end up in the kingdom of heaven. Now, you and I don't get to keep our scars. You and I, in translation, when Jesus either raises us from the grave or translates us into immortality in those skies and we go to heaven, we don't keep our scars. We're made whole. We're made to live through eternity. But Jesus keeps his scars as a reminder of the great love the Father has for each of us, as a reminder of that eternal sacrifice in our behalf as a reminder of where we come from. And what a wonderful reminder it is. You know, part of our job in eternity is to share this great love. And we need a point of reference. Jesus will always be that point of reference for us as to where we are and where we come from. Now, just to back up, to understand Thomas's background, he was probably a fisherman. You realize that the Gospel of John deals with Jesus' ministry around Galilee. And typically, in that day and age, men were fishermen. That's what they did around Galilee. This is where he pulled a lot of his disciples from. Thomas did not just abandon all hope and go back to fishing. He was there with his disciples. He held on, and even through this valley of doubt, he still waits amongst the disciples. Each of us, goes through experience sometimes in our spiritual walk where we feel like everybody around us is doing better. Have you been there before? Where you feel like no matter what you do, no matter what you're trying to do in your own spiritual walk, that your prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling and that nobody's hearing you, that you're not really growing, that you're stagnating, that you're having problems with temptation, you're having issues with this or that or the other thing, and everybody else around you seems to be fine and dandy, just doing well. That's exactly how Thomas felt. That's exactly where he was at in his own walk with the Lord at this point in his life. There were 8 days of dealing with this, where all the other disciples are just rejoicing. And I'll tell you one thing that really depressed people really don't like is happy people. It's just the truth. If you're depressed and if you're despondent, to be around other happy people just makes you more depressed and more despondent. Sure, it's nice to have somebody that cares about you, but if everybody else is around you is just rejoicing and happy, you can imagine the kind of state of mind Thomas felt himself in. And there's only one person that could have turned all of that around, and that was Christ himself, to come into his life and to show him reason to believe. So what about you? Where's your faith this morning? Where's your strength this morning? Do you feel weak? Do you feel despondent? Do you feel like Thomas? Let me give you a hint here. When you look inside the Bible and you read about those of faith, whether from Moses all the way down to John the Revelator, all the way through, we want to act like that faith is just this constant thing that's always this straight line that goes across. That's not the case. That's just not reality. That's not how faith works. Faith is like this: hills, valleys, hills, valleys. You know why? Because we're in a world filled with sin. We're in a world that's overrun with the enemy. We're in a world that's all filled with temptation and problems and issues. And our emotions and our faith and everything else that we rely on to keep us connected to God, that stuff can waver sometimes. That stuff can keep us on our toes. And if we think that, we're up high one time, it's easy to realize that at some point in life there's going to be issues and problems. The one thing that I can promise you in life is that you're going to have problems. That's just the reality of life. Each of us, in our own way, faces all kinds of issues and problems. But the clue is, and even in regards to Thomas, one of the things that we see with him, one of the issues that we see with Thomas, is that when all the disciples fled, you remember when Jesus was betrayed by Judas, all the disciples fled, a lot of those disciples came back together. Thomas didn't. He kept away for some time, and that's why he missed the first appearing of Christ. One of the things that we need for faith in our lives is each other. You realize that? Thomas kept away from those apostles, and he paid the price by not seeing the Lord the first time. When we pull ourselves away from our church family, when we pull ourselves away from those of faith, well, guess what happens to our faith? Does it get stronger? No, it gets weaker. It gets weaker and weaker until finally we find ourselves into a despondent place. It's so important to have one another to build our faith. The Bible talks about iron sharpening iron. And we need that. Our faith needs to rub against one another so that there can be sparks of truth and light in our life. Thomas was guilty of that. He did not at first rejoin with the disciples after the betrayal of that Friday evening. He should have come back together. I don't know where he went to. The scriptures don't tell us where he went to, but he wasn't there. He wasn't part of that group. Even in their hour of despair, he wasn't there. And so he paid the price forever being named this doubting Thomas. But I love how Jesus ends with Thomas in verse 29. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. And the promise that we have, that we can hold on to this morning, is blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. Jesus was thinking about you in those words in Scripture. Jesus was thinking about all of us who want rational proof for everything in our life. He wants us to hold on in belief. He knows that we need him, and he wants us to believe. Even though it seems unbelievable at times, Christ is there watching out after each of us and helping us in our walk. My prayer for you this morning is that your walk would be strong, that you would join with Jesus in knowing that he is alive and real, and that we'd learn the lesson of Thomas, not to draw away, but to draw close to one another and thus draw close to the Lord. With that, let's go ahead and sing our final hymn, Abide with Me, number 50. Hymn number 50.